somewhere in the lower galleries of the British Museum, past the Assyrian lion hunts and the great winged bulls guarding doorways that no longer exist, there is a room where the air is carefully controlled. The humidity stays constant, the temperature never fluctuates, and in drawer after drawer of archival trays, laid on beds of inert foam, sit pieces of clay that are older than the concept of a library itself. One of those pieces, small enough to rest in two cupped hands, the colour of pale sand dried to bone, contains what may be the oldest succession crisis ever committed to writing. It is a fragment from the standard Babylonian version of what scholars call the Anzu epic. The clay is cracked along the top right corner. Several lines are missing, but the lines that remain are readable. They have been readable in one form or another for nearly 3,000 years, and what they describe is a moment so structurally precise, so institutionally specific, that it sits uncomfortably between two worlds, the world of mythology and the world of history. The text describes a theft, not a theft of gold or cattle or land. What was stolen, according to the scribes who pressed their reed styluses into wet clay and recorded this account, was the authority to govern everything. The object taken is called the Tupi Shimati in Akkadian, the Tablet of Destinies, and in the Sumerian imagination, whoever held it held the right to rule not just a city, not just a kingdom, but the entire ordered world, the fates of gods and humans alike, the architecture of civilization itself. The being who stole it was called Anzu, part eagle, part lion, a guardian who turned predator, and the moment he pressed the Tablet of Destinies to his chest and launched himself into the sky, something unprecedented happened in the divine assembly. The texts say the gods fell silent, not in reverence, in paralysis, because without the Tablet of Destinies, no decree could be issued, no command could take effect, no one could officially hold power. The succession, the chain of legitimate authority that ran from the highest god down through every rank of the divine assembly, had been severed in a single act of theft. What you are listening to tonight is an investigation of that moment. And not only that moment, but all the moments like it, the disputes, the votes, the floods, the coronations, the stolen objects and contested offices that appear throughout the Cuneiform record, across dozens of tablets, excavated from buried cities, translated over more than a century by scholars who dedicated their lives to making these voices audible again. If you are settling in somewhere comfortable right now, a quiet room, a dark space, the soft hour between wakefulness and sleep, wherever you are listening from, take a moment and let yourself arrive there. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Tell us where you are and what time it is. It is something the scribes of Nippur would have done in their way. They recorded the hour of composition. They noted who was present. They believed that the moment of transmission mattered, because what those scribes preserved in clay was not, in their view, a collection of entertaining stories. The Sumerians appear to have believed that what they were recording was institutional memory, the documented record of how authority worked, how it was claimed, how it was lost, and how civilizations were built on the question of who had the right to inherit the earth. The Anzu epic is one piece of that record, but it is only the beginning, because the Anzu text, carefully examined, reveals something that mainstream readings tend to pass over. The theft of the Tablet of Destinies is not presented as an isolated act of chaos. It is presented as a crisis of succession. Anzu did not steal the tablet arbitrarily. According to the texts, he stole it at the moment of maximum vulnerability, when the highest god, Enlil, had set it aside during his morning ritual bathing. He knew the rotation of authority. He had been close enough to the centre of power to understand when the tablet was unguarded, which raises a question the text does not answer directly, but which the structure of the narrative implies with uncomfortable clarity. What kind of institution produces someone who knows exactly when and how to seize its highest office? That question is what this investigation is about. Not the creature Anzu specifically, but the system that made his theft possible, the hierarchy it disrupted, the war it started, and the extraordinary series of text tablets from Nippur, from Nineveh, from Sippar, from Ur, that record, in cumulative detail, what appears to be a civilization spanning succession crises over who would inherit the right to govern Earth. The clay is still here, the words are still readable, and the crisis, as the texts describe it, is still unresolved. A civilization that arrived fully formed. To understand what the Sumerian texts are describing when they speak of divine succession, you first need to understand something about the civilization that produced them, because the Sumerians themselves are, in a very specific sense, anomalous. Most civilizations develop gradually. There are tentative settlements, early experiments in agriculture, slow accumulations of craft knowledge. The archaeological record shows centuries of incremental development before anything we might recognise as urban complexity appears. Toolmaking improves generation by generation. Writing systems develop from crude pictographs over long periods. Legal codes emerge from centuries of custom and conflict. The Sumerians do not follow this pattern neatly. When archaeologists began excavating the ancient mounds of southern Iraq in the 19th century, they found something that surprised them repeatedly. The oldest identifiable layers of Sumerian urban culture, what scholars now call the Uruk period, dating roughly from 4000 to 3100 BC, contained evidence of fully developed administrative systems, standardized writing, complex temple architecture, long-distance trade networks, and a sophisticated theological framework, all appearing within a relatively compressed archaeological horizon. This is not to suggest that the Sumerians had no prehistory. They did. The site of Eridu, widely regarded as the oldest continuously occupied urban site in Mesopotamia, shows occupation layers stretching back to approximately 5400 BCE. But the transition from small settled community to the kind of administrative complexity visible at Uruk, Nippur and Lagash is by archaeological standards strikingly rapid. The excavations that gave scholars their first real access to this world began in 1889 when a team from the University of Pennsylvania arrived at a site in central Babylonia called Nippur. The expedition was led initially by John Peters, with John Henry Haynes as the expedition photographer and primary field worker, and later by Hermann Hilprecht, the Assyriologist responsible for interpreting what they found. The site they were excavating had been known by its local name, Nufar, for centuries, but beneath that mound of wind-blown soil and collapsed mud brick lay one of the most important religious and literary archives in human history. Nippur was not a commercial city. It was never a political capital in the conventional sense. What made Nippur singular, what scholars came to understand through decades of painstaking excavation and translation, was that it was the ritual centre of the Sumerian world, the city of Enlil, the place where the divine assembly was believed to convene, where the Eka temple stood, the mountain house of the gods, and where the scribal schools, the aduba or tablet houses, trained generations of scribes who copied, recopied and preserved the literary and theological tradition of Sumerian civilization. The University of Pennsylvania team recovered tens of thousands of tablets from Nippur. Many of them were administrative, ration lists, property transfers, contracts, but a significant portion were literary, hymns, myths, lamentations, legal codes, royal inscriptions, and the narratives of the divine assembly. Fragments of the same texts appeared and reappeared across different excavation seasons in different tablet collections because the scribal schools had copied them so prolifically. A myth that survives today in 43 separate manuscript copies was not preserved by accident. It was preserved because someone decided, deliberately and systematically, that it needed to survive. The Sumerian king list is perhaps the most famous product of this preservation tradition. The most complete extant version is the prism known as the Weld Blundell Prism, now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but the earliest fragment, a small clay tablet designated WB62, also held at the Ashmolean under catalogue number 1923444, predates the prism and preserves only the portion of the list dealing with the antediluvian kings, the rulers who reigned before the Great Flood. The opening line of the Sumerian king list is one of the most discussed sentences in all of ancient literature. In Sumerian it reads, Namlugal Antaid Deaba, which translates essentially as, when kingship descended from heaven. Scholars have read that phrase in many ways. Some treat it as a metaphor for the divine sanction of royal authority, a theological claim that human kings ruled by the grace of the gods. Others read it as a cosmological statement about the origins of civilization itself. A few, in the alternative tradition, have taken it more literally as a statement about actual events preserved in institutional memory. What all readings share, however, is an acknowledgement that the Sumerians had a very specific theory of where authority came from. It did not arise from human consensus, it did not emerge from the accumulation of force or the inheritance of property, it descended from a source above human society, through a chain of transmission that could be interrupted, redirected, contested, and crucially, inherited. The Sumerian king list goes on to name the cities where kingship resided in succession, first Eridu, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. Before the flood, 8 kings are listed, each reigning for thousands of years. After the flood, a new list begins. The phrase recurs, Namlugal when kingship descended from heaven, as if the flood had not merely ended a geological era, but reset the succession, as if authority itself had to be re-established, re-granted, redescended. The scholarly interpretation, represented most clearly in the work of Thorkild Jacobson, who spent much of his career at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, translating and analysing Sumerian religious texts, is that this framework reflects a genuine Sumerian theory of governance. Jacobson argued that Sumerian political theology imagined the divine assembly as a kind of primitive democracy, a body of great gods who deliberated, voted, and issued binding decisions. The king was not self-appointed. He was appointed by the assembly, endowed with the Nam Lugal, the office of kingship, and expected to serve as the assembly's representative on earth. Jacobson's framework has been refined and in some ways challenged by subsequent scholars, but its basic architecture has held. The Sumerians did appear to believe that legitimate authority required assembly sanction, that kingship was an office, not a bloodline, that it could be withdrawn, and that it had, at least once, been the subject of catastrophic disagreement. The anomaly that conventional scholarship does not fully address, or rather addresses at the level of theology rather than institutional history, is the remarkable consistency with which these texts describe the same structural problem. Again and again, across different myths, different periods, different literary traditions, the same crisis recurs. A figure of great power challenges or subverts the assembly's established succession order. The tablet of destinies changes hands. A decision is taken by a faction rather than the whole. A god acts unilaterally, and each time the narrative that follows describes not just the resolution of one conflict, but the re-establishment of a succession order that had been fundamentally disrupted. Whether this is pure theology, or encoded political philosophy, or something else entirely, the consistency is worth examining on its own terms, because Nippur is still there. Beneath the desert of south-central Iraq, it still lies partly unexcavated, and the tablets that came out of it, many of them still being translated, catalogued and studied, continue to complicate simple readings. What they complicate, above all else, is the assumption that the divine succession crisis was a metaphor, the assembly that ran the world. Before the succession crisis can be understood, the institution it disrupted needs to be understood, and that institution, the Purim, the divine assembly of the Anunnaki, is one of the most carefully documented bodies in all of ancient religious literature. The word Anunnaki itself is worth pausing on. Its most widely accepted scholarly derivation renders it as something like princely offspring of Anu, An being the sky god, an ultimate source of divine authority, and Ki or Naki referring to the offspring or descendants. The Britannica defines the term as a class of gods within the ancient Mesopotamian pantheon, acknowledging that the precise meaning remains debated. But in the Sumerian texts themselves, the Anunnaki are not an undifferentiated mass of divine beings. They are a ranked hierarchy, a structured body with specific roles, specific authorities, and specific obligations. The highest tier consisted of the great gods, Anu at the apex, then Enlil and Enki, then Ninhursag. Below them, a broader assembly of Anunnaki who voted on matters of cosmic significance. Then the Igigi, a class of lesser divine beings associated with labour. The hierarchy was not merely spiritual, it was administrative. It determined who had the right to issue binding decrees, who controlled which domains, and who could grant authority to human kings. Enlil's position within this hierarchy was, during most of the period from which the Sumerian literary tradition emerges, the central one. Anu was nominally supreme, but remote, a sky god who had, in the cosmological imagination, separated himself from the earth long before the human world was created. Enlil was the active executive of the divine assembly. He held the tablet of destinies. His decrees were described in the text as unalterable. His city Nippur was the ritual centre of Mesopotamia, precisely because it was where Enlil's temple stood, the Akur, the mountain house. The Akur hymns, preserved in the Accessal collection under Catalogue 451, drawing on tablet sources from the Nippur collections, describe the Akur in terms that make clear it was understood not merely as a religious building, but as a governmental seat. The hymns describe gods coming to Nippur from across the world to receive Enlil's judgment. They describe decrees being issued from the Akur that determined the fates of cities, which would prosper, which would fall. They describe the assembly convening in the Akur's great hall, debating, deliberating, and eventually reaching decisions that had the force of cosmic law. Jacobson, in his 1976 work The Treasures of Darkness, described this divine assembly as functioning according to what he called primitive democracy, a deliberative body in which great matters were decided by consensus, but in which consensus could break down, in which powerful figures could act unilaterally, and in which the outcomes of disputes were recorded and preserved in the literary tradition as foundational events. He was careful to note that this was not democracy in any modern sense. The assembly was hierarchical. The great gods held far more influence than the lesser ones, but the deliberative structure was real, textually attested, and appears in multiple independent traditions. What makes the assembly particularly significant for the succession crisis narrative is the specific mechanism by which authority was exercised within it. Authority in the divine assembly was not simply a matter of seniority or genealogy. It was tied to the possession of specific offices, Nam Eng, Nam Lugal, Nam Dieg in itself, and to the physical custody of the Me, the divine laws that defined the functions of civilization. The Me included, according to the lists preserved in Nippur tablets, concepts as varied as priesthood, descent to the underworld, musical instruments, the scribal arts, the craft of the smith, the art of making decisions, even, intriguingly, the descent of the god from heaven to earth. Each Me was understood to be a real thing, not a metaphor, not an abstraction, a physical and operative reality that could be held, carried, and transferred. The myths describe them as objects that can be loaded onto a boat. They have weight, they have presence. Whoever held the Me held the functional capacity of the civilization attached to them. Enlil's central position in the divine assembly rested in significant part on the fact that he held the most important of all these objects, the tablet of destinies. As long as Enlil held the tablet, His authority was unchallenged. His decrees stood. The succession was stable. The question that the Sumerian texts keep returning to in different narratives, across different eras with different protagonists, is what happens when that stability breaks. And the answer, consistent across multiple independent sources, is everything that followed. The assembly that ran the world, the texts suggest, was always one contested succession away from catastrophe, the object that made you king. In the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC, the era from which most of the surviving literary tradition of the Sumerians derives, scribes in the tablet houses of Nippur and other cities were copying, refining and systematically preserving a body of texts that described what legitimate authority actually was, not in the abstract, in specific, physical, institutional terms. Central to almost every major narrative of divine authority is the Tupi Shimati, the Tablet of Destinies. The Akkadian term is precise. Tupi means tablet, a clay writing surface, the standard medium of Mesopotamian administration. Shimati derives from Shimtu, meaning fate, destiny, or fixed assignment. Together, the phrase designates not a mystical artifact, but something closer to what we might call a constitutional document, a tablet on which the ordained structure of authority, who holds what office, who commands whom, whose decrees take precedence, has been fixed. The texts that describe it are consistent in a way that scholars find noteworthy. In the Anzu epic, when Anzu steals the tablet, the immediate consequence is not chaos in the human world. The immediate consequence is that Enlil's commands lose their force. The Akkadian phrase used is Eli ilani rabti ukimu shimati, a line that has been translated as the destinies of the great gods were suspended, not destroyed, suspended, as if the tablet were a ratifying mechanism for divine authority. Without it, commands were issued but could not be enforced. This is a very specific institutional description. It implies that authority in the divine assembly was not inherent to persons, but vested in offices, and that those offices were defined and legitimized by a document, a tablet, a record. Amar Anus, whose scholarly edition of the standard Babylonian Anzu epic remains one of the most important academic works on the text, notes that the Anzu narrative belongs to a broader cycle of Ninurta mythology that consistently deals with questions of legitimacy, succession, and the recovery of divine authority. The Anzu epic is not simply a monster-slaying story. It is, in Anus's reading, a myth about the restoration of institutional order after a succession crisis, specifically the return of the ratifying mechanism of authority to the legitimate holder. The physical description of the tablet in the texts is deliberately vague. We are not told its size, its specific contents, its appearance in detail. What we are told is where it was kept, on Enlil's chest, pressed against his body, worn as a sign of office during his waking hours, and what happened when it was removed. This detail of location is significant. Enlil did not store the Tablet of Destinies in his temple treasury. He wore it. The tablet was not merely a document to be consulted. It was an emblem of continuous, embodied authority. Its presence on Enlil's person was the ongoing demonstration of his legitimacy. When Anzu took the tablet at the moment of Enlil's ritual bathing, the one moment in each day when Enlil removed it, he did not simply steal an object. He interrupted the chain of embodied authority. He inserted himself into the succession by force, claiming the tablet as proof of his own right to rule. The mainstream scholarly reading, represented in works by scholars, including W.G. Lambert and Stephanie Dalley, treats this as a theological dramatization of the problem of cosmic order. Anzu represents the forces of disorder, primordial chaos in winged form, and his theft enacts the mythological scenario that requires Ninurta, the divine champion, to restore order on behalf of the assembly. In this reading, the Tablet of Destinies is a symbol of cosmic coherence, and its theft is a symbolic threat to universal order. This interpretation is sound and well supported, but it leaves several textual details unexplained. The first is the assembly's response. When Anzu steals the tablet, the great gods do not immediately mobilize to recover it. The text describes them as falling into deliberation, meeting, debating, seeking a champion. Anu calls on one god, then another. Several refuse. There is a passage in which the great gods express, in language that is unusually restrained for divine beings, something very close to fear. Not fear of Anzu's physical power, but fear of the consequences of any action. If they act without the tablet to ratify their commands, any decree they issue may not hold. This is not how you describe chaos. This is how you describe a constitutional crisis. The second unexplained detail is Anzu's motivation. The texts do not describe him as mindlessly destructive. Before his theft, he had been appointed by Enlil as a guardian of the Akur, a position of significant trust. He had access to the inner sanctum, he had proximity to the tablet, and the texts describe him, before the theft, observing Enlil's power and being seized not by hatred but by something closer to ambition. The Akkadian phrase il tanalak il tanakut libi, his heart kept going, kept falling, suggests a prolonged internal process, a calculation, a decision taken over time. What kind of myth gives its monster a motivation rooted in bureaucratic envy? What kind of theological story makes the villain a former court official who understood exactly which document to steal? The alternative reading, not a dismissal of the mythological framework, but an extension of it, is that the Anzu narrative encodes something the scribes understood very precisely, that succession crises are not random eruptions of chaos. They are engineered by figures close to power who have studied the mechanisms of authority and identified the precise point of maximum vulnerability. Whether Anzu was a real political actor, a coded memory of an actual historical event, or a timeless archetype of succession disruption, is a question the texts deliberately leave open. But the structural logic of the narrative is institutional, not merely cosmological. And that institutional logic connects directly to every other succession crisis recorded in the Sumerian textual tradition. Because the Anzu story was not the first, and it was not the last. The first theft, when a god stole heaven's keys. The standard Babylonian version of the Anzu epic exists in 3 tablets, preserved across multiple manuscript copies, the most significant of which were recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, excavated by Hormuzd-Rassam in the mid-19th century, and now held in the British Museum's Kuyunjik collection. The relief sculpture known as BM 14571, an alabaster panel from Nimrud, now in the British Museum, depicts the critical scene, Ninurta, winged and armed, pursuing the great eagle lion across the sky. The narrative arc of the 3 tablets is deceptively simple on its surface. Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies. The assembly is paralysed. Ninurta is commissioned to recover it. After failed initial attempts, Ninurta succeeds, kills Anzu, and returns the tablet to Enlil. Order is restored. But the texture of the narrative, the specific choices the scribes made in describing each stage of the crisis, reveals a far more layered institutional portrait than the summary suggests. The opening of Tablet 1 establishes Anzu's credentials before establishing his crime. He is introduced not as a chaotic monster, but as a figure of recognised power, the king of all mountain birds, dwelling on the mountain summit, a being whose roar shook the earth. When Enlil appoints him as guardian of the Akur, it is not a decision taken lightly. The text implies that Anzu earned this appointment, that he had demonstrated qualities that made him suitable for the role of guardian at the seat of divine authority. This detail matters because it defines the succession crisis as something that could only have occurred from within. An external enemy could not have taken the Tablet of Destinies, because the tablet was in Enlil's personal custody in his inner sanctum. Only someone with intimate knowledge of the Ekka's routines, the timing of Enlil's ritual bathing, the specific moment the tablet left Enlil's person, could have engineered the theft. Anzu did not break in from outside, he was already inside. The theft itself is described in Tablet First with a brevity that feels almost procedural. Ilk tupi shimati, he sees the Tablet of Destinies. no struggle, no alarm raised initially. The action was so swift, so precisely timed, that Enlil could not prevent it. By the time the temple attendants realised what had happened, Anzu was already airborne, the tablet pressed against his chest, ascending to his mountain stronghold. Then comes the passage scholars find most institutionally revealing, the paralysis of the assembly. The great gods convene, but without the tablet, Enlil cannot issue binding commands. His authority has been severed at its ratifying mechanism. Anu, the sky god, addresses the assembly and asks who will recover the tablet. He turns first to Adad, the storm god. Adad refuses. He turns to Shara, the son of Ishtar. Shara refuses. A third deity is asked, and also declines. Each refusal is described in parallel language. The god in question heard the word of Anu. His heart was too frightened to go. The repetition is significant. In Mesopotamian literary convention, parallel structure signals thematic emphasis. The threefold refusal is not narrative padding. It is a precise statement about the nature of the crisis. The conventional instruments of divine enforcement have been rendered ineffective. The gods who would normally carry out Enlil's commands cannot do so, because Enlil's commands no longer carry institutional force. The succession of authority has been interrupted, and no one knows how to restore it through the normal channels. It is the mother goddess, variously named Mami or Belet Eli, who eventually proposes Ninurta as the champion, and her reasoning, as recorded in the text, is worth noting. She does not describe Ninurta as the strongest warrior or the most fearsome deity. She describes him as the one whose appointment the assembly can legitimately sanction. He is Enlil's son, the designated heir of Enlil's martial authority. His mission to recover the tablet is framed not as a heroic adventure, but as a lawful commission from the assembly. This framing transforms Ninurta from a mythological hero into something more precise, a legitimate claimant to the succession, acting on behalf of the institution to restore the correct succession order. The battle that follows in Tablets the 6 and 3 is dramatic, but the resolution is more interesting than the conflict. When Ninurta finally defeats Anzu and recovers the tablet, the text does not describe him keeping it. He returns it to Enlil. He does not claim the Tablet of Destinies for himself, although the logic of conquest might suggest he could. And the assembly, in response, bestows on Ninurta a series of titles and epithets that scholars have identified as the vocabulary of succession endowment. He is given new names, new authorities, new domains. His status in the divine hierarchy is elevated as direct consequence of his service to the succession order. The reward structure is as important as the theft itself. The Anzu epic does not conclude with a simple restoration of the status quo. It concludes with a modified succession order. Enlil retains the tablet, but Ninurta has been formally elevated in the hierarchy as the legitimate heir apparent of Enlil's martial authority. The crisis has been resolved, but the resolution has also shifted the succession landscape. This is the structural logic that appears, with variations, in every major Mesopotamian succession narrative. A crisis disrupts the established order. A champion acts to restore it. The restoration produces a new succession configuration, and the scribes preserve the record of that configuration carefully, repeatedly, in multiple copies across multiple generations, as if the precise details of the succession settlement matter enormously, which of course they would if these were records rather than stories. The Anzu epic was still being copied in the Neo-Babylonian period more than 1,000 years after its earliest versions were composed. Amaranus, in his 2002 scholarly edition, published by the State Archives of Assyria Cuneiform text series, identifies manuscripts from Nineveh, Assur, Sultan Tepe and Nippur, spanning centuries of continuous copying. This is not how you preserve an entertaining tale. This is how you preserve a constitutional precedent. What precedent? Perhaps this one, that the Tablet of Destinies, the ratifying mechanism of divine authority, had been contested before, that the succession had been interrupted before, that it had been restored, but only through a specific act of legitimately commissioned force, and that the resulting succession order, with Ninurta elevated as Enlil's heir, was the lawful arrangement that all subsequent governance rested upon, unless of course something happened to challenge it again, the brothers and the divided earth. 3 tablets, baked in the sun-dried mud of Sippar during the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa around 1635 BC, contain what may be the most explicit account of a divided divine assembly in the entire cuneiform record. They are held in the British Museum under catalogue numbers BM 78941, BM 78942 and BM 78943. Together they constitute the most complete surviving version of the text scholars call the Atrahasis epic, named for its human protagonist Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise. The Atrahasis epic begins before humans existed. It opens in a time when the divine assembly governed a world populated only by gods, specifically by the Anunnaki above and the Igigi below. The Igigi were the labouring class of the divine hierarchy, lesser gods assigned to dig the great watercourses, to maintain the earth, to perform the physical work of cosmic maintenance. The Anunnaki supervised. The Igigi worked. The opening succession crisis of the Atrahasis epic is not between Enlil and Enki, it is between the Anunnaki administrators and the Igigi labourers. The Igigi, after 40 years of unceasing labour, strike. They burn their tools. They march on Enlil's residence at Nippur. They surround the Eka and pound on its gates through the night. The assembly convenes in emergency session. Enlil is described as visibly shaken, an unusual depiction for the Lord of all gods. He calls on Anu to determine whether the Igigi's rebellion is justified. Anu investigates and delivers a verdict. The Igigi's burden is too heavy. Their complaint is legitimate. This is the first formally recorded decision of the Divine Assembly in the Atrahasis narrative, and it sets the structural pattern for everything that follows. The Assembly does not dismiss the grievance. It acknowledges it. It then assigns Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water and crafts, to propose a solution. Enki's solution is the creation of humanity. Human beings will take over the labour of the Igigi, freeing the lesser gods from their burden. The Assembly agrees. Humans are created. The Igigi are relieved of their work. What follows is a slow-motion succession crisis played out across centuries of human population growth. Humanity multiplies. The noise of human civilization, the Akkadian word is rigmu, meaning noise or clamour, disturbs Enlil's sleep. Enlil, acting within his authority as Lord of the Assembly, decrees a series of plagues and disasters designed to reduce human population. Each time Enki intervenes. He sends warnings to a favoured human, Atrahasis, in indirect ways, speaking through a wall, through a dream, through the structure of an oracle, that allow humanity to circumvent Enlil's decrees. This is the succession crisis hidden inside the flood narrative. Enlil issues lawful decrees from his position as holder of the Tablet of Destinies. Enki consistently and deliberately subverts those decrees. The two brothers, both sons of Anu, one holding executive authority, one holding the portfolios of wisdom and craftsmanship, are acting in direct opposition to each other within the Assembly's own institutional framework. Scholars have debated the nature of this conflict extensively. The mainstream interpretation, represented clearly in the work of W.G., Lambert and A.R. Millard, in their 1969 critical edition of the Atrahasis text, treats the Enlil-Enki opposition as a theological framework for understanding divine providence, Enlil representing the harsh, impersonal forces of cosmic necessity, Enki representing the compassionate, interventionist impulse toward the preservation of wisdom and life. In this reading, the flood and its survival are a balanced theological statement about the dual nature of divine governance. This reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The specific legal language of the Atrahasis epic suggests something more institutionally precise than a theological balance of forces. Enlil does not simply decide to flood the earth. he brings his decision to the assembly. The tablets describe a council meeting, Pu'aruum, at which the destruction of humanity is formally voted upon. The key phrase in the text is, Ina Puhimulko Shimsu, in the assembly they fixed its fate. The flood is not Enlil's unilateral act, it is an assembly decision. And Enki does not simply rescue Atrahasis out of personal kindness. When questioned after the flood, Enki defends himself with a precise legal argument. He did not violate the assembly's decree, he argues, because he never told Atrahasis directly that a flood was coming. He spoke to the wall of the reed house. The wall told Atrahasis. Enki's hands, technically, are clean. This is the argument of a practiced institutional actor, someone who understands that the assembly's authority is real, that violating its decrees carries consequences, and that the only safe way to subvert an unjust ruling is through procedural ambiguity rather than open defiance. What does it mean that the God of wisdom is portrayed, in the oldest succession narrative involving human beings, as an institutional lawyer gaming the procedural rules of the divine assembly? It could mean that this is a sophisticated theological allegory. It could mean that the scribes were encoding a philosophical argument about the limits of executive authority. Or it could mean something closer to institutional memory, a preserved record of a genuine division within the assembly between a faction that held the instruments of executive power and another faction that held the instruments of knowledge, craftsmanship, and, crucially, the loyalty of they, humans on whom the entire order depended. Because after the flood, the division between Enlil and Enki does not resolve, it hardens. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet She, the flood tablet held in the British Museum under catalogue number K3375, discovered in Nineveh and translated by George Smith in 1872, contains the same scene in compressed Akkadian form. When Enlil sees that a human has survived his flood, his reaction in the tablet is described with a word that translators have rendered as rage, fury, and in some readings, something close to institutional outrage. He was not angry simply that Atrahasis survived. He was angry that a decree of the assembly had been circumvented, that the succession of authority he held had been publicly made to look ineffective. His anger, in the context of the Atrahasis narrative, is the anger of a leader whose institutional authority has been systematically undermined by a colleague within the same governing body, not an external enemy, a brother. The Enlil-Enki division is the structural axis of the Sumerian succession crisis. It runs through nearly every major narrative in the textual tradition. It appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the Gilgamesh flood account, in the Eridu Genesis, and, in a different key, in the myth of Enki and the world order, where Enki's assignment of divine offices and domains is read by some scholars as a subtle assertion of a parallel authority structure to Enlil's. Two brothers, both children of Anu, both ancient, both powerful, governing two different portfolios of the same world, and never, in the surviving textual record, fully reconciling the fundamental question of which of them held the higher authority. The Atrahasis tablets from Sippar do not resolve this question. They are the document of a divided assembly, making a catastrophic collective decision followed by a divided aftermath in which the division between executive authority and wisdom authority was exposed as permanent. And the question they leave behind is one the later textual traditions spent centuries trying to answer. If the two brothers cannot agree on who holds the higher right, if the assembly itself cannot resolve the succession, who decides? Inanna's gambit, seizing power from the inside. There is a point in the Sumerian succession narrative where a third figure enters the conflict, not through force, not through legal argument, but through a combination of cunning, timing, and an audacity that the texts describe with something very close to admiration. Her name is Inanna, or, in the Akkadian tradition, Ishtar, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love, war, and everything in between. And what she did, according to the tablets preserved in the Nippur collections and catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature under the reference 1.03.01, was walk into Enki's domain in Eridu, sit down at his table, and drink him into giving her the foundations of civilization. The text is known by scholars as Inanna and the Me, or sometimes Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization from Eridu to Uruk. It is one of the most extensively studied texts in the Sumerian literary canon, and one of the most structurally revealing for what it tells us about how power actually moved in the Sumerian theological imagination. The Me, the divine laws, the operating principles of civilization, were held by Enki in his temple at Eridu. The text provides what amounts to an inventory. Over 100 distinct Me are listed, each representing a functional domain of civilized life. They include the high priesthood and the lowly priesthood, the descent to the underworld and the ascent from it, the arts of the smith, the scribe, the carpenter, the leatherworker, music, the drum, the tiji instrument, the augur instrument, the craft of decision-making, the craft of making lamentations, treachery, goodness, righteousness, the plundering of cities, the making of peace. The scope of the list is what makes it significant. These are not simply religious rites. They are the complete operational taxonomy of a functioning civilization. Every craft, every institution, every social role, every form of knowledge required to build and maintain a complex society, and they were held in a single place by a single god in the form of objects. Inanna travels from her city of Uruk to Eridu to visit Enki. The text does not explain her motive with complete clarity. Scholars including Samuel Noah Kramer, in his foundational 1944 work Sumerian Mythology, suggests she goes to acquire the Me for her city, to make Uruk the new centre of civilization. Enki receives her warmly. He orders a feast prepared. Beer and wine are brought. The two gods drink. Then, in a passage that has the texture of a carefully prepared diplomatic manoeuvre rather than a spontaneous evening, Enki, described as intoxicated, begins giving Inanna the Me, one by one. The text lists them. He gave her the high priesthood. He gave her the godship. He gave her the noble, enduring crown. He gave her the throne of kingship. He gave her the noble sceptre. Inanna, the texts record, receives each gift and loads it onto her boat of heaven, the vessel she has brought to Eridu for this purpose. When Enki wakes from his intoxication and asks his minister Isimud what has happened, Isimud reports the transfers one by one, and for each one the text records that Enki then says, "I have not given them to her," but Isimud replies each time, "My master has given them to her, he has given her, and the transfer stands." The scholarly interpretation of this text ranges widely. Kramer read it primarily as a mythological explanation for why Uruk, rather than Eridu, became the dominant city of early Sumerian civilization, a cultural memory of the transfer of political and religious preeminence from one city to another, encoded in divine narrative. Jacobson emphasized the role of the Me as divine norms, the fundamental principles that gave civilized life its structure, and saw Inanna's acquisition of them as a mythological statement about the universalization of those norms through their association with the most widely worshipped goddess in the Mesopotamian world. Both readings are persuasive. Neither, however, fully accounts for the procedural precision of the text. Inanna did not steal the Me in the way Anzu stole the Tablet of Destinies. She received them as gifts, voluntarily bestowed during a social occasion that she had engineered. The transfer was witnessed by Enki's own minister. It was documented within the myth itself through a formal recitation of each item transferred. When Enki attempts to recover the Me by sending divine messengers to intercept Inanna's boat of heaven, she refuses to return them, and the text describes her argument in terms that are essentially legal. She received them lawfully as gifts freely given, and no subsequent claim can override A. Gift ceremony. This is the vocabulary of institutional transfer, not mythological theft. What the Inanna and the Me text appears to encode, at minimum, is a third-party succession manoeuvre. While Enlil and Enki were locked in their long institutional conflict over the mechanisms of executive authority, the Tablet of Destinies on one side, the Instruments of Cosmic Administration on the other, Inanna had identified a third category of power, the operational me, the functional, building blocks of civilization, and she had transferred them to her own city through a process that was technically legal, strategically brilliant, and institutionally irreversible. There is a detail in the list of me that scholars occasionally remark upon, but rarely develop at length. Among the over 100 items Inanna received from Enki is listed Namlugal, kingship, not the Tablet of Destinies, not the specific document that defined who held executive authority in the Divine Assembly, but kingship itself, as a me, as a portable, transferable property of civilization. If the succession crisis at its deepest level was about who held the right to distribute kingship to human rulers, who had the authority to descend the Namlugal from heaven to earth, then Inanna's acquisition of Namlugal as one of the me is not a peripheral detail. It is a direct intervention in the succession contest. It means that the goddess, who would later be worshipped as the patron deity of kings, the one who invested human rulers with divine sanction in the royal hymns of the Earth 3 period, had her claim to that function grounded in a specific, textually documented acquisition. The Inanna and the Me text, held in the Penn Museum CBS tablet collection, alongside dozens of other Nippur tablets, appears in over 30 manuscript copies from the Old Babylonian period. It was one of the most copied literary texts in the Sumerian canon. Whatever it encodes, theological statement, political allegory, institutional record, the scribes of Nippur apparently considered it essential enough to reproduce generation after generation. The succession crisis, as these tablets reveal it, was not a simple two-party conflict. It had at least 3 major claimants, each approaching the problem of authority through a different strategy. Enlil held the ratifying mechanism. Enki held the operational toolkit. Inanna had seized the transferable infrastructure of civilization itself. And into this already complicated landscape, a fourth figure was preparing his own bid. The son who would be king, Ninurta's claim. In the southern quarter of Nippur, during the excavations conducted between 1889 and 1900 by the University of Pennsylvania team, workers uncovered layers of the scribal quarter, the Adubba, or tablet house, that contained some of the most complete literary texts recovered from Mesopotamian archaeology. Among them were multiple copies of a lengthy Sumerian poem known as Lugal Iod Malembinegla, most commonly abbreviated as Lugal-E, and translated as O King, the radiance of whose splendour is lofty. It is catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature under reference 1.06.02. The poem runs to several hundred lines and describes the martial exploits of the god Ninurta in considerable detail. On its surface, it is a war narrative. Ninurta battles a monster called the Asag, defeats it, then rearranges the landscape of the world, assigns properties to stones, and receives a new name for the mother goddess. It has the character of an epic poem celebrating divine power through conquest. But beneath its martial surface, Lugal-E is a succession document. The first critical element is Ninurta's relationship to Enlil. Ninurta is explicitly identified in the Nippur literary tradition as Enlil's son, his legitimate heir, born of Enlil and Ninlil, raised in the divine household of the Ekor. In the succession logic of the Sumerian divine assembly, this genealogical fact matters. It means that Ninurta has a hereditary claim to Enlil's authority. But in the Sumerian assembly system, hereditary claim alone is not sufficient. The Namlugal does not pass automatically. It must be granted by the assembly. It must be earned through demonstrated fitness. Lugal-E is the narrative of that earning. The Asag, the monster Ninurta battles in the poem, is not simply a chaos creature in the Tiamat tradition. The text described the Asag as something more specific, a being that has disrupted the mountain territories, whose power is rooted in the rocks and stones of the earth, and whose defeat requires not just force, but the kind of wisdom that reorganizes the world's structure after the battle. When Ninurta kills the Asig, he does not simply stand over its body and declare victory. He transforms the landscape. He uses the stones of the defeated enemy to build the Zagros mountain range, directing the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates. He assigns new properties to every stone, some beneficial, some dangerous, in an act that parallels Enki's assignment of the me to the domains of civilization. This is the succession argument embedded in the poem's narrative architecture. Ninurta does not simply demonstrate that he can fight. He demonstrates that he can order, that after the destruction he can reconstruct the world according to principles that serve the divine assembly's purposes. He is not just a warrior, he is an administrator, a legitimate successor. The climax of Lugal-E involves a specific succession gesture that scholars have analysed carefully. The mother goddess, who throughout the Nippur literary tradition bears the name Ninhursag, witnesses Ninurta's reorganisation of the mountain landscape and bestows on him a new title, Ninurta. But the poem describes something more than a name change. It describes a formal endowment. She assigns him specific divine offices, specific domains, specific acknowledgements of his authority that replicate the structure of Enlil's own investiture. Ninhursag, already the holder of significant divine authority herself and a member of the 4 highest gods of the Sumerian assembly, is, in this passage, acting as a succession conferrer. Her endorsement of Ninurta's claims is not merely celebratory, it is institutional. It places her authority behind his succession claim. There is an anomaly in Lugal-E that the mainstream heroic reading does not fully explain. After Ninurta's victory and his formal endowment by Ninhursag, the poem includes a passage in which Enlil speaks. And what Enlil says is not simply congratulation. He acknowledges Ninurta's deeds and then issues a series of blessings that have the formal character of a succession declaration. May his command be foremost in the mountains. May his weapons be preeminent. The verb used for foremost, sasa'ag in Sumerian, is the same verb used in royal inscription texts to describe the primary position of a king among kings. It is succession language. Enlil is not simply praising his son. He is recording, in formal language, an acknowledgement of Ninurta's elevated status within the divine succession order. Lugal-E survives in numerous manuscript copies from Nippur, spanning from the Old Babylonian period through the Neo-Babylonian. Amar Anus, in his 2002 monograph, identifies it as part of a Ninurta literary cycle that explicitly develops the theme of legitimate succession through merit and divine commission. The cycle also includes the Anzu epic, creating a single coherent narrative arc. Ninurta is commissioned by the assembly to recover the Tablet of Destinies, succeeds where others failed, is rewarded with elevated succession status. Then, in Lugal-E, he proves further fitness for rule through cosmic reorganization and receives formal succession acknowledgement from both the Mother Goddess and Enlil himself. What the Nippur scribes appear to have been preserving across these multiple texts is a sustained argument for a specific succession settlement, not a random collection of heroic tales, a structured cross-reference textual case for Ninurta's legitimate position as the designated heir of Enlil's authority. This would matter enormously if there were competing succession claims being advanced in the same era. And as the textual record makes clear, there were. Enki's portfolio, the wisdom traditions, the craft knowledge, the me, the loyalty of the human beings his actions had repeatedly saved, formed the basis of a competing succession argument. Inanna's acquisition of the me of kingship provided yet another axis of potential challenge. And beyond all of these, a fourth claimant was gathering strength in a city that had not even existed during the original Nippur succession debates. His name was Marduk, and his bid for succession would change everything. The flood as a political decision. Before Marduk's succession can be understood, the flood must be revisited, not as a natural disaster, not as a moral judgment, but as a political decision, documented in multiple independent cuneiform sources, each providing a slightly different angle on the same institutional event. The Sumerian tradition preserves 3 independent accounts of the flood decision, each originating from a different textual tradition. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on a tablet in the Penn Museum bearing the catalogue number CBS 673, excavated at Nippur in 1893 and translated by Thorkild Jacobson in a landmark 1981 article in the Journal of Biblical Literature, contains what appears to be the oldest Sumerian version of the flood. Narrative. The tablet is fragmentary, and the sections dealing with the assembly's initial decision to send the flood are partially broken, but the portions that survive describe a divine council meeting at which the flood is formally decided, and a protagonist named Zusudra who receives advance warning. The Atrahasis epic version, on the 3 Sippar tablets in the British Museum already discussed, provides the most detailed account of the assembly's deliberations. The flood is not a first response. It is a final option, reached after a series of prior interventions, plague, drought, famine, each of which was Enlil's decree, and each of which was subverted by Enki. The assembly's eventual vote for the flood is described in language of institutional exhaustion, the prior measures have failed, human population has recovered, the noise persists, and Enlil argues before the assembly that a decisive solution is required. The third version, Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, BMK 3375, provides the clearest account of the aftermath. After the flood subsides and Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood survivor, emerges from his vessel and offers sacrifices, the gods gather around the offering like flies. Enlil arrives and sees Utnapishtim alive. His reaction is recorded in language that translators including Stephanie Daly render as fury. He demands to know how a human survived his decree. And then comes the critical exchange. Enki steps forward and delivers what amounts to a formal defence of his actions before the assembly. Was it I who disclosed the secret of the great gods? Enki asks. He argues, as in the Atrahasis version, that he spoke not to Utnapishtim directly, but to the wall of the reed house. And then he adds something the Atrahasis version does not include so explicitly. He says to Enlil, impose your penalty on the transgressor, impose your penalty on the guilty, but don't wipe out all of mankind, don't destroy all of humanity. Enki is not apologising. He is making a constitutional argument to the assembly. He is saying that Enlil's decree was disproportionate, that the institutional authority of the Tablet of Destinies does not extend to the total annihilation of the labour force that the assembly itself created. And he is making this argument in public, before the assembled gods, in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic action that he has demonstrably countered. What happens next in Tablet C is rarely discussed at length in popular accounts of the flood narrative, but it is perhaps the most institutionally significant passage in the document. Enlil, after hearing Enki's argument, does not maintain his position. He goes to Utnapishtim and his wife, takes them by the hand, blesses them, and grants them immortality, placing them at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, outside the normal order of human mortality. This is not a defeat. It is a negotiated settlement. The flood survivor is preserved as a special case, exceptional, immortal, removed from the cycle of human reproduction that created the problem in the first place. The assembly's decision is honoured in its catastrophic outcome, but the future is restructured to prevent the same conflict from recurring. Enlil and Enki reach, through this settlement, an institutional compromise. Humanity is preserved, but its relationship to mortality, its numbers, are now bounded differently. The 3 texts together create a composite picture of the flood as a multi-stage institutional negotiation. First, the assembly votes. Then, a member of the assembly subverts the vote through procedural creativity. Then, the assembly reconvenes in the aftermath. Then, a settlement is negotiated that restructures the conditions of the original problem. Then the entire sequence is formally recorded and preserved. This is not the structure of a myth about divine caprice. This is the structure of a documented institutional process, preserved with remarkable consistency across 3 independent textual traditions for nearly 2,000 years. The question that the flood narrative raises for the succession crisis is not whether the flood happened, it is what the flood decided. After the flood, Enlil's authority was preserved but demonstrably limited. His decrees could be circumvented by a sufficiently clever institutional actor with a better argument. Enki's authority was vindicated but equally limited. He had saved humanity, but he had done so through evasion rather than open challenge, and the assembly had ratified a settlement that constrained future action. Neither brother had won. The succession was still open. Into this unresolved institutional landscape, the question of the next holder of the Tablet of Destinies remained, and the answer, when it came not from Nippur at all. It came from a city to the south, rising to power on the plains of Babylonia, whose patron god was building a claim to divine succession through a narrative so comprehensive, so systematically constructed, that it absorbed every previous succession story into a single new framework. That narrative was called the Enuma Elish, and its resolution of the succession crisis would reshape Mesopotamian civilization for the next 1,000 years. Marduk's revolution, how a city god became king of heaven. The circumstances of the Enuma Elish's discovery are themselves a kind of institutional drama. In 1872, George Smith, an assistant at the British Museum who had taught himself cuneiform while sorting and cataloguing the thousands of clay fragments recovered from Nineveh by Hormuzd Rassam, sat down with a fragment from the Kuyunjik collection and began translating. He was reading the 11th tablet of what would later be identified as the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. He reached the flood passage. He recognized the story. He reportedly became so excited that he began removing his clothes in the reading room of the British Museum, a story that may be apocryphal but has been told by colleagues who claim to witness it. The Nineveh tablets that Smith was translating had been assembled for the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned from approximately 668 to 627 BCE and commissioned a systematic collection of every important text in the Mesopotamian literary tradition. The 7-tablet Enuma Elish was among the most important texts in that collection. It was copied with care in neat Assyrian cuneiform on tablets that the library catalogues describe as belonging to the series Enuma Elish, literally, when on high, the opening words of the text. The tablets found in Nineveh are late Assyrian copies of a text that scholars believe was originally composed in the Old Babylonian period, most likely in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC, around the time that Babylon was rising to political dominance under the First Babylonian dynasty. The scholarly debate about the precise date and circumstances of composition is ongoing. Stephanie Daly, in her 1989 translation of Babylonian myths, places the composition in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I in the 12th century B6, while other scholars prefer an earlier date, but all agree that the Enuma Elish was deliberately composed as a succession document. The text is explicit about its purpose in a way that most ancient religious literature is not. It begins with a cosmogony, the story of how the world came to exist from the primordial waters of Tiamat and Apsu. But what drives the narrative is not cosmological curiosity, it is a succession crisis. The younger gods, the Anunnaki of the new generation, are noisy. Their activity disturbs the primordial god Apsu. Apsu decides they must be destroyed. Enki Ea hears of this and, in an act that recapitulates his flood narrative pattern of subverting destructive decrees through preemptive action, kills Apsu first and establishes his own domain in the primordial waters. The succession disruption has in effect already happened before Tiamat begins her war. Tiamat, Apsu's consort and the mother of the primordial waters, then decides to avenge Apsu. She raises an army of monsters, she creates a champion, Kingu, and binds the Tablet of Destinies to his chest. Here the Tablet of Destinies reappears, and its reappearance is institutionally significant. Tiamat, in delegating her authority to Kingu, does not simply appoint him her general. She invests him with the succession ratifying mechanism. She gives him the tablet. His possession of it makes him technically the legitimate holder of divine authority for the duration of Tiamat's succession claim. The Anunnaki are terrified. Anu confronts Tiamat and retreats. Enki goes to face her and turns back. The paralysis that followed Anzu's theft of the tablet recurs in a new key. The gods with legitimate claims to succession authority cannot face the current holder of the tablet. However, illegitimately, that holder acquired it. Marduk's entry into the narrative follows the same structural logic as Ninurta's in the Anzu epic. The assembly requires a champion, and the champion's commission becomes the basis of his succession elevation. But the Enuma Elish develops this logic far more extensively than the Anzu epic does. Before Marduk agrees to fight Tiamat, he negotiates. He stands before the assembly and delivers what amounts to a constitutional demand. If he defeats Tiamat, he will be supreme among them. His word will be unalterable. His command will persist forever. The assembly agrees. They confirm his elevated status before the battle, not after. This is a different succession logic than Ninurta's. Ninurta was elevated as reward for service already rendered. Marduk is elevated as a condition of service to be rendered. The distinction matters. Ninurta's succession was merited and then ratified. Marduk's succession was ratified and then earned. It was a constitutional grant before the fact. Marduk defeats Tiamat. He retrieves the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu and seals it with his own seal. And then, in the passages of the Enuma Elish that constitute the explicit succession document of the narrative, the assembly begins the process of transferring all divine authority to Marduk. The vehicle for this transfer is the 50 names of Marduk, recorded across tablets 6 and 7 of the Enuma Elish. Scholars including Andreas Seri, in a landmark 2006 article in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, have analysed the 50 names as a systematic theological program. Each name assigns Marduk the authority previously held by a different member of the divine succession hierarchy. He receives names that had been Enlil's epithets. He receives names associated with Enki's domains. He receives names connecting him to Anu's cosmic authority. The 50 names, in series analysis, represent the complete consolidation of the succession, every prior claim, every competing line of authority, subsumed into a single divine office. The number 50 is not incidental. In Sumerian mathematics, 50 was Enlil's number, the sacred number associated with his divine rank in the pantheon. By giving Marduk 50 names, the Enuma Elish is not simply celebrating its hero, it is performing, in the text itself, the transfer of Enlil's numerical identity, the mathematical signature of his supreme rank, to the new succession holder. Enlil does not disappear from the Mesopotamian pantheon after the Enuma Elish. He remains present, worshipped, venerated. But his structural position, the one who holds the Tablet of Destinies, the one whose decrees are unalterable, the one who confers Namlugal on human kings, is formally transferred to Marduk in the Enuma Elish's succession document. He becomes the previous holder, the honoured predecessor, rather than the current executive of the Divine Assembly. What is most remarkable about this succession transfer from the perspective of the broader crisis narrative is what it reveals about the Enlil-Enki division. Marduk is Enki's son. His succession, ratified by the entire assembly, sealed with the Tablet of Destinies, confirmed through the 50 names, is, in structural terms, a victory for the Enki line over the Enlil line in the long succession contest that the Atrahasis epic had documented. The son of the god of wisdom becomes the supreme authority in the divine assembly, absorbing Enlil's titles and the powers that Enlil had held through the Tablet of Destinies. The two brothers' long institutional conflict, fought through floods and legal arguments and subverted decrees, is resolved in the Enuma Elish, not through confrontation, but through the elevation of a third-generation claimant who inherits from both lines. Whether this succession resolution reflects a theological development, a political reality, the actual rise of Babylon to regional dominance and the corresponding elevation of its patron deity, or a formal institutional record of how authority was reorganized in the divine assembly, is the question the texts leave open. Perhaps all three are true simultaneously. Perhaps the theology, the politics, and the institutional memory are the same thing, approached from different angles. The Enuma Elish was still being recited in Babylon on the fourth day of the New Year festival, the Akitu, in the late Babylonian period. The king of Babylon participated in a ritual reenactment of Marduk's succession, his appointment, his victory, his assumption of the Tablet of Destinies. The succession crisis was not merely remembered, it was annually rehearsed. The civilization that had emerged from the crisis performed its resolution every year, as if to confirm that the settlement still held. The scribes who recorded a wound. There is a building in Nippur that archaeologists call the Aduba, the tablet house, the scribal school. It is not archaeologically a single building. It is a tradition, a recurring institutional form that appears in layer after layer of Nippur's occupation history, always in the same general area of the city, always identifiable by the same kinds of artifacts. Hundreds of practice tablets, student exercise texts, master copies alongside novice approximations, lists of names, lists of gods, lists of kings, lists of the words for different types of boat. When Hermann Hilprecht and his team from the University of Pennsylvania excavated the scribal quarter of Nippur between 1889 and 1900, they found this material in such density that it took decades to catalogue. Some of the tablets were practice exercises, students copying standard phrases, standard vocabulary lists, standard passages from well-known literary texts. Others were master copies, final, clean versions of complete literary works stored in the Tablet House archive as reference texts for future copying. The distribution of these texts tells a story of its own. The myths dealing with the succession crisis, the Anzu epic, Lugal-E, the Enlil and Ninlil text, the Atrahasis epic, the Inanna and the Me, appear not occasionally but systematically in the Nippur scribal record. Copies of these texts appear in multiple generations of student work. They appear in the master archives. They appear in what scholars call exercise tablets, where a student has been assigned a specific passage to copy, and the passage chosen again and again is a passage dealing with the nature of divine authority, the structure of the assembly, the legitimacy of succession. The Enlil and Ninlil text, preserved in the Penn Museum's CBS collection as part of the Nippur holdings, catalogued in the ETCSL under reference 1.02.01, is a narrative that deals, on its surface, with Enlil's expulsion from Nippur and his descent to the underworld. Enlil, having committed an act against Ninlil that the divine assembly judges unacceptable, is banished. He goes to the underworld. But Ninlil follows, and during his absence, a series of succession substitutions are arranged. Deputies are appointed to hold Enlil's positions while he is away. His authority is temporarily distributed across a set of stand-ins, and eventually he returns, and the succession order is restored. The succession theology of this text is subtle but precise. It establishes two important precedents. First, that even Enlil's authority can be suspended by the assembly acting in judgment, and second, that succession can be maintained through temporary delegation when the primary holder is absent or disqualified. Both precedents are relevant to the larger succession crisis narrative. Both would have mattered to the scribes who copied this text generation after generation. Why would a scribal school prioritise in its curriculum texts dealing with the procedural rules of divine succession? The mainstream answer, offered by scholars including Nirk Veldhuis, in his work on the Old Babylonian scribal curriculum is that these texts were chosen because they were linguistically complex and stylistically prestigious. Copying them demonstrated advanced competency. The succession narratives happen to be among the most sophisticated literary texts available, and their inclusion in the curriculum reflects their literary status, not necessarily any special emphasis on succession theology. This is a sound and conservative reading, but it coexists uneasily with some of what the Nippur tablets show about the curriculum's other priorities. The Eduba texts from Nippur include a set of documents that scholars call the dialogue texts, scribal debates, arguments between students about the value of their craft. In these texts, scribes repeatedly articulate what their training is for. The most consistent answer in the surviving dialogue texts is not literary excellence. It is preservation, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, the maintenance of the record against the erosion of time. Scribes were, in the Sumerian self-understanding of their role, the custodians of institutional memory. The tablet house was not just a school, it was an archive. And what it archived, obsessively across centuries in multiple copies of key texts, was the record of how authority worked, how it had been contested, how it had been resolved, and what the legitimate succession order was. The Penn Museum tablet 291560, part of the Nippur collection, contains a portion of the Enlil and Sud text, ETCSL 1.0202, which deals with Enlil's courtship of the goddess who would become Ninlil. It is a charming text on its surface, a narrative of divine romance, but it is also, structurally, a document about the formation of the primary succession lineage, the union of Enlil and Ninlil that produces Ninurta, the designated heir. The tablet is a genealogical record as much as a love story. The scribes who copied it, working in the tablet house at Nippur sometime in the Old Babylonian period, were not merely practicing their cuneiform signs. They were copying the foundation document of a succession lineage. They were preserving the genealogical basis of a claim to divine authority that their civilization depended on understanding clearly. What does it mean when a civilization builds its educational curriculum around succession documents? It could mean that the succession crisis was so foundational to Sumerian political theology that it became the natural content of elite education, the way constitutional documents became foundational to certain modern educational traditions. It could mean that the scribes were genuinely uncertain about aspects of the succession settlement and were preserving multiple competing versions as a hedge against institutional forgetting. Or it could mean something else entirely, that the wound opened by the original succession crisis was still in some institutional sense unhealed, that the question of who had the right to hold the Tablet of Destinies, to confer Namlugal, to be the legitimate executive of the Divine Assembly, was a question that Sumerian civilization could not stop asking, not because it was an abstract theological puzzle, but because the answer to that question determined the legitimacy of every human king who sat on every throne from Eridu to Nineveh. The scribes recorded the wound, generation after generation in hundreds of copies, pressed into clay that would outlast every dynasty whose legitimacy they underwrote. They wrote as if they knew the question would still matter when the clay had dried to stone. 3 ways to read a succession crisis. At this point in the investigation, the evidence is substantial. Across a dozen tablets, multiple excavation sites, centuries of scribal copying, and several independent textual traditions, a consistent pattern has emerged the Sumerian and Babylonian literary record preserves, in remarkable structural detail, an account of a sustained contest over divine. Succession authority, the same institutional elements recur: the Tablet of Destinies, the Divine Assembly, the commission of a champion, the contested transfer of authority across the Anzu epic, the Atrahasis texts, the Gilgamesh flood tablet, the Inanna and the Me narrative, Lugui, and the Enuma Elish. 3 interpretive frameworks have currency among scholars, and each deserves honest consideration. The first is the purely mythological reading. In this framework, The succession narratives are theological allegories, sophisticated symbolic stories that use the drama of divine conflict to articulate cosmological principles. Enlil represents order and executive authority. Enki represents wisdom, craft, and the preservation of life. Their conflict is the eternal tension between law and mercy, between cosmic necessity and human compassion. Marduk's succession is the theological justification for Babylon's political dominance. Ninurta's elevation is the mythological expression of the martial values of kingship. The Tablet of Destinies is a symbol of cosmic coherence, not a literal object. This reading is supported by the literary sophistication of the texts themselves, by the theological consistency of the divine character portrayals across different traditions, and by the mainstream scholarly consensus represented in the work of Jacobson, Lambert, Daly, and their successors. It explains why the same narrative elements recur across different periods and traditions, not because they record different episodes of a single crisis, but because they are variations on a set of enduring theological themes. The second framework treats the succession narratives as encoded political philosophy, a kind of institutional wisdom literature that uses divine drama to teach principles of governance. The Divine Assembly, in this reading, is a model for human political organisation, a demonstration of how authority should be structured, how decisions should be made, what happens when institutional order breaks down, and what legitimate succession looks like. The Tablet of Destinies is a symbol of constitutional authority. The Assembly's deliberations are a model of deliberative governance. The Flood decision is a case study in the dangers of executive overreach and the importance of dissent within an institutional framework. This reading is supported by the fact that these texts were used in scribal education, that the succession narratives formed part of the curriculum through which future administrators, judges, and royal advisors were trained. If the texts were teaching tools, they were teaching institutional principles through narrative, which is consistent with how wisdom literature functions across many ancient traditions. It also explains the procedural precision of texts like the Atrahasis epic, where the legal arguments and assembly procedures are described with a specificity that goes well beyond what pure mythology would require. The third framework is the most speculative, and it must be clearly identified as such. It proposes that the succession narratives preserve, at some level of encoding that scholars are still working to fully understand, a historical memory of actual events, not necessarily events involving the literal beings described in the texts, but events, institutional crises, power transitions, contested transfers of authority that the Sumerian civilization experienced and preserved in the language of divine narrative because that was the only institutional language available to them. In this framework, the consistency across independent textual traditions is not accidental. The repeated appearance of the same structural elements, the Tablet of Destinies, the Paralysed Assembly, the Commissioned Champion, the Negotiated Settlement, reflects not theological creativity but institutional memory. The scribes were not composing variations on a theme. They were copying records of a crisis whose resolution determined the legitimacy of the civilization they served. This reading is supported by the structural precision of the legal and procedural language in the texts, by the extraordinary investment in preservation that the scribal tradition demonstrates, and by the Sumerian self-understanding expressed in the king list, in royal hymns, in administrative documents, that the current order of civilization was inherited from a prior arrangement that had been disrupted and then restored. Each framework has genuine explanatory power. Each accounts for some features of the evidence that the others struggle with, and crucially, they are not mutually exclusive. A text can be simultaneously a theological allegory, a wisdom teaching, and a preserved institutional memory, just as a constitutional document can be simultaneously a legal instrument, a philosophical statement, and a historical record. What none of the three frameworks can fully account for is the persistence. Not just the persistence of the texts themselves, though that is striking enough, but the persistence of the question. 5,000 years after the first cuneiform signs were pressed into the clay of Nippur, scholars are still debating what the Tablet of Destinies was, who held it legitimately, and what the succession crisis meant. The texts have survived every civilization that tried to preserve them and every civilization that forgot them. They have been buried, excavated, fragmented, translated, disputed, and translated again. The question they preserve has not been answered, perhaps because it was never intended to be, what the inheritance actually was. If the succession crisis, read through any combination of the three frameworks just examined, was real in some functional sense, if the contest over the Tablet of Destinies, the Assembly's divided votes, the competing claims of Enlil and Enki and Inanna, Ninurta and Marduk represent something more than pure storytelling, then the question becomes, what exactly was being fought over? Not a throne. The Sumerian divine assembly was not a monarchy in the conventional sense. The great gods did not compete for a single seat of power. The Purim was a deliberative body with distributed authority. Anu held the sky. Enlil held the decrees. Enki held wisdom and water and craft. Ninhursag held life and the stony earth. Inanna held love and war, and after her acquisition of the me, much of civilization's operational infrastructure. The succession contest was not a contest for a single crown. What was actually being contested was something more fundamental, the right to descend Nam Lugal from heaven to earth. The Sumerian king list opens with when kingship descended from heaven, and that descent was not a one-time event. It recurred. After the flood, it recurred. After the fall of each city's dynasty, it recurred. The king list records the mechanism. Kingship moves from city to city, always legitimized by the divine assembly's decision about where to direct the Nam Lugal. Eridu falls, kingship goes to Uruk. Uruk's dynasty ends, kingship goes to Kish. And so on, through the historical and semi-historical record. The god or divine faction that controlled the mechanism of Nam Lugal descent controlled the legitimacy of human kingship. Not just one king, but all kings, not just one dynasty, but the entire succession of human authority over the earth. This is the inheritance at stake in the succession crisis, not divine thrones, human ones. Enki and the world order, the Sumerian myth, catalogued in the ETCSL under reference 1.01. O3, drawing on Nippur tablet sources, describes Enki's assignment of divine offices to the various departments of civilization. He appoints gods to govern agriculture, the sea, the rivers, the arts, the crafts. The scholar Richard Averbeck, in a 2003 article in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, notes that in this text, Enlil was granted Enki control of the Mies, the functional offices of civilization, and that Enki's subsequent assignments constitute the practical distribution of civilizational authority through a chain of divine delegation. What Enki does in the world order text, in other words, is serve as the intermediary between the supreme authority of the assembly and the functioning of human civilization. He distributes the operating systems of civilized life to their appropriate divine administrators. The human world does not govern itself. It runs on divine software maintained by a hierarchy of divine administrators, ultimately sourced from the assembly's collective authority. In this framework, controlling the me, which Inanna partially acquired, which Enki held primarily, which were ratified by the Tablet of Destinies that Enlil kept, was not an abstract theological power. It was the direct administrative authority over how human civilization functioned. The succession crisis over the Tablet of Destinies was simultaneously a crisis over who controlled the operating parameters of human society. The concept of Nam-En, lordship, specifically the priestly lordship of a temple city, was distinct from Nam-Lugal in the Sumerian administrative vocabulary. A city could have a Nam-En, an En priest, who embodied the divine presence of the city's patron deity without having the Nam Lugal, the kingship that allowed military and political dominion. The distinction mattered because the Nam Lugal was specifically the assembly's gift, the thing that descended from heaven, while the Nam En was more locally rooted. Nippur, as the scholars of the Sumerian city-state volume published by the Royal Academy note, notably never held Nam Lugal itself, even though it was the religious centre of Sumerian civilization, the seat of Enlil's temple. Nippur was the source of Nam Lugal, it did not hold it. This distinction encodes the succession logic precisely. The divine assembly's seat of authority and the grant of human kingship were different things. The assembly could be at Nippur in Enlil's Eker, while the Nam Lugal descended to Uruk, or Kish, or Ur. The succession of divine authority over the assembly was separate from the succession of human kings who received the assembly's mandate. What the succession crisis disrupted each time it erupted, with Anzu's theft, with the flood decision, with Marduk's constitutional revolution, was not just the internal governance of the divine assembly, it was the chain of transmission between the assembly and the human world. Every time the question of who held the Tablet of Destinies was unsettled, the mechanism by which human kings received their legitimacy was suspended. This is why the scribes preserved these texts with such obsessive care. This is why the Adaba curriculum centered on succession narratives. This is why the Enuma Elish was recited annually in Babylon at the New Year festival, with the king performing his own ritual re-endowment of authority, because every human king's right to rule rested on a chain that ran back through the divine assembly, back through whoever held the Tablet of Destinies, back to the original descent of Nam Lugal from heaven to earth. If that chain was broken, if the succession was unresolved, if the tablet's legitimate holder was contested, then every king downstream was potentially illegitimate. The inheritance at stake in the Sumerian succession crisis was not the divine throne, it was the right to make human civilization legitimate. And what the texts record, in clay, in dozens of copies, across 5,000 years of preservation, is that this question was never fully settled. The succession had been contested, partially resolved, contested again, and resolved again in different forms. But the final settlement, the definitive answer to who held the right to descend Nam Lugal from heaven, is not written in any tablet that survives. Perhaps it was never written. Perhaps the scribes understood that some questions do not have final answers, that the succession of authority over human civilization is always, in some sense, provisional, always dependent on the ongoing deliberation of whatever assembly, divine or human, holds the mechanisms of legitimacy. The question the tablets left unanswered. Somewhere in the lower galleries of the British Museum, the clay fragment rests, the piece of the Anzu epic that opened this investigation, small enough to hold in two cupped hands, the colour of pale sand dried to bone. The scribe who pressed those signs into wet clay did not know that he was writing for 5,000 years of future readers. He did not know that his city would be buried, his language forgotten, his gods disassembled by later theologies into symbols and metaphors and footnotes. He wrote because writing was his function, because the tablet house had trained him for this, because someone, long before him, had decided that this specific account of a specific succession crisis needed to be preserved. He wrote, and the clay dried, and the earth covered it, and it waited. What arrived here tonight, through the chain of excavation and translation and scholarly argument and quiet narration, is not a complete answer to the questions the texts raise. The tablets themselves do not provide complete answers, they provide evidence. Carefully preserved, institutionally prioritized, multiplier-tested evidence of a civilization that believed something had been contested at the very foundations of its existence, and that the record of that contest needed to survive. Whether the succession crisis was real in the sense of involving actual beings making actual decisions, whether the Anunnaki were what the Sumerians believed them to be, is a question that 5,000 years of accumulated knowledge has not resolved. The mainstream scholarly position is that the texts record a theological and political mythology of extraordinary sophistication, a system of ideas about authority, legitimacy, and succession that served the political needs of successive Mesopotamian civilizations. This position is well supported and intellectually serious. But the structural precision of the institutional language, the legal arguments embedded in the flood narratives, the procedural specificity of the assembly deliberations, the obsessive preservation of succession documents in the scribal curriculum. These features do not prove anything. They suggest, they imply. They raise the question, quietly, in the meditative manner of clay that has waited 3 millennia, of whether something more than symbolic drama was encoded in these texts. The Sumerian king list says kingship descended from heaven. The Atrahasis epic describes the assembly that decided to destroy the beings that kingship was descending to. The Anzu epic records the moment the mechanism of that descent was stolen. The Enuma Elish records the final succession settlement that re-established the chain. And the tablets, hundreds of them, in museum drawers and university archives across 3 continents, record every contested moment in between. The succession crisis, as the texts preserve it, began with a theft and ended with a coronation. But the question at its centre, who has the right to make human civilization legitimate, to descend authority from wherever it originates down to the people who must live under it, that question did not end with Marduk's 50 names. It is still being asked. In different languages, with different instruments of ratification, in different assembly halls. The specific figures change. The structural logic does not. A civilization built its entire educational curriculum around this question. Its scribes dedicated their lives to preserving the record of every attempt to answer it. Its kings performed annual rituals to confirm that the current answer still held. Perhaps they knew something that only becomes visible from the far end of 5,000 years of institutional history, that the succession of legitimate authority is never fully settled, that the tablet of destinies is always, in some sense, in transit, moving from one hand to the next, ratifying each holder provisionally, waiting to be claimed by whoever can make the most compelling case before the assembly. The clay fragment in the British Museum contains a question pressed into it by a scribe whose name we do not know, in a city that no longer exists, about a crisis whose ultimate resolution the texts never record. It asks, in the careful formal Akkadian of a professional who understood the weight of documentation, who holds the right to rule? The scribe set down his stylus, the clay dried, and the question outlasted everything else. If this investigation resonated with you, if the weight of those tablets felt real in the quiet of wherever you are, consider leaving a gentle mark in the comments. The scribes of Nippur noted who was present. There is something ancient about the act of recording that you were here, that you heard this, that the transmission continued. Rest well. The clay is patient. The question will be here when you return.